News Hub is the news division of a media company in my native New Zealand. The company owns a television station, a few radio stations, and a website. And on Tuesday, they ran a story under the headline, "Ex-ACT leader says the pleasure of drinking from a plastic straw is more important than the ocean." ACT is a political party in New Zealand, and I am the ex-leader referred to. Perhaps they knew I was going to give a talk on fake news and wanted to do me a favor, because the story is an utter misrepresentation. Of course, I never ever said that drinking from a straw is worth destroying the ocean. I don't know the journalist, so I can't be sure of his motivation. I suspect it's broadly political. He probably disagrees with the kinds of ideas that I promoted when I was in politics in New Zealand, and he wants to discredit those ideas in my party by making me look like a fool or a maniac of some kind. He misrepresented me. He misled his audience for the sake of promoting an agenda. He provided them with what some people call an alternative fact. It should really be called an alternative to fact. Now, there's nothing unusual about News Hub. Fake news seems to be everywhere these days. Spend a few minutes on Facebook or Twitter, and you will surely encounter fake news. It's really terrible. Still, nothing should be done to stop it. The politicians who tell you that they want to crack down on fake news should concern you more than the politicians who peddle fake news. Or, since they're normally the same people, they should concern you more when they're complaining about fake news than when they're peddling it. That's what I want to use the rest of my 17 minutes to convince you of. Now, the first thing to note is that fake news and social media are nothing new. Media is, by definition, social, and the only difference between the new forms and the old forms is that the new ones are much faster and cheaper, and the old ones were just as good for peddling falsehoods on. My father was a bomber pilot in World War II. His squadron would often fly over the Low Countries where they were supposed to hit military targets and miss by miles often, destroying the homes of their allies. The next day he'd read in the newspaper, "Bomber squadron destroys weapons factory in Ghent," or something like this. Total fabrications. It's been going on in war forever, but it's been going on outside war for a long time as well. In 1924, for example, there was a famous incident where the Daily Mail ran a story with excerpts from a letter written by the head of the Communist International in the Soviet Union to the head of the British Communist Party. The excerpts were damaging to the Labour Party and helped the Conservatives win the election that was upcoming. But the story was a complete forgery. I could spend the rest of this talk giving you examples of fake news from the past, and I would hardly have scratched the surface. Of course, there may be more fake news today than there was, but that's simply because there's so much more news. When the cost of publishing collapses to almost zero, as it has with the new technology, the quantity of news explodes. You get not only a lot more falsehoods, but a lot more truths. And that's why the phenomenon that is increasing the amount of fake news is also making it less dangerous. Fake news is almost always exposed as such within just a few days. I'll give you a recent example. I think last week, or maybe the week before, there was a story run by several newspapers in Britain claiming that Parliament had passed a law which said, in this bill, it said that animals cannot feel pain. That was the story. It was completely untrue. It was exposed as such within, I think, a day, and the newspapers who had run it retracted it. That kind of thing now goes on all the time. Now compare this with the situation in the 19th century. Think of a farmer, again in New Zealand. He's a sheep farmer. He goes into town once every 3 months, and when he's there, he goes to the local library and reads a 6-month-old copy of the Times of London. Well, the paper's sure to involve some errors, if only accidentally. He'll get some false beliefs by reading this newspaper, and then he'll go back to his farm. When will his errors ever be corrected? There's really no mechanism whatsoever. He could probably die with those false ideas. We have made tremendous progress in combating error. And yet, for some reason, there's a kind of hysteria about fake news, as if it's a terrible new phenomenon, and people are calling for the authorities to do something about it, as they almost always do nowadays. And of course, the authorities are doing something about it. In Germany, the Network Enforcement Act, which has recently been passed, means that if a website such as Twitter or Facebook doesn't remove a story that a judge has deemed to be false, they can be fined 50 million euros. President Macron of France is so impressed by this that he wants to bring in a similar law in France. And in Britain, a story that didn't seem to get much attention, the government has set up a unit within the army to combat fake news and alternative narratives. So the idea here is that the authorities, some government official or judge, will decide what's true and what's false, and then take actions to make sure that we can only say and hear and read what's true. Now, what could be wrong with this idea? Surely we just want the truth. Well, at least two things are wrong with this idea. The first is that governments are themselves peddlers of fake news. You don't have to live in Korea to experience this. Most of you here will be familiar, for example, with the dodgy dossier, which helped to promote our invasion of Iraq in 2003. Some of you may not be familiar with a more interesting example in a way, a more amusing one, from the previous Gulf War in 1991. At that time, to try to get public support for the invasion, American government officials helped to promote a story that Iraqi soldiers had gone into a Kuwaiti hospital and removed babies from incubators so that they could send those incubators back to Iraq for use in Iraq. I mean, that's monstrous, isn't it? And you really do have to invade people like that. The only problem is that the story was an utter fabrication. The idea that governments will protect us from fake news it's not a case of poacher turned gamekeeper. It would be a case of the poacher being the gamekeeper. It wouldn't protect us from fake news. It would simply give the government a monopoly on fake news. Which brings me to the second major objection to this idea, which is that monopolies are bad for progress. Everybody knows this in the case of commerce. It's a very familiar idea. Consider car manufacturing. If a car manufacturer faces no competition, if he has a monopoly, he doesn't have to make good cars, doesn't have to make them good value, and he doesn't have to innovate. He doesn't have to find ways of making better and better cars because he faces no competition. Whatever gives him the monopoly protects his profits. Well, the same is true in the case of ideas. We make progress through competition. The astonishing progress, intellectual progress that we have made over the last 500 years is founded on a very simple but historically unusual idea. And that idea is that there is no place for authority when it comes to what we should believe, when it comes to what's true and what's false. Kings, clerics, all these grand people, judges, they are fallible. The truth is not authorized, the truth is discovered. And it's discovered through competition between ideas. Now, let me explain this a bit, because it's not immediately obvious what that means. In the first instance, truth is discovered by competition with reality. Suppose you go out one night and you get a bit drunk, and you come to the view that you live at 221B Baker Street. You proceed home, you arrive there, you don't recognize the door, your key doesn't open the lock. Reality has shown you that you were wrong. But now you've still got to work out where you do live. And for this, you need an alternative idea. It's no good, it's not enough just that you know you don't live at 221B Baker Street, you need an alternative idea. Once you have that alternative idea, you can go there and you can test that idea with your key. So this is how science works. Scientific experiments, of course, are designed to make the scientific theory confront reality. But when it fails That's not quite enough. Science doesn't progress simply by abandoning theories. It progresses by replacing them. We then move to the next best, the better theory that we have. Science progresses through a competition between theories. The theories that win the day are those that best explain the observable facts. But that victory is always only provisional. A better theory may come along, it may do a better job of explaining the facts, and then that theory is the one that we move to. This is how progress happens, unless, of course, the authorities intervene to prevent the free competition of ideas. This most famously happened in the case of the Catholic Church and Galileo. They convicted him of heresy in 1633 for saying that the Earth orbited the Sun, but it also happens in other authoritarian regimes. In the Soviet Union, there was approved science, and most of the approved science was false, and it was crowding out and stopping progress occurring. Now, this new idea that's rising up again, this idea that the authorities should decide what's true and false and allow us only to see the true, it's actually an old idea. It's the pre-Enlightenment idea that benighted Europe and today still benights many authoritarian regimes such as Saudi Arabia and North Korea. Curiously, this new authoritarianism is finding support from student radicals and their professors who reject notions like truth and reason and evidence and logic as nothing more than impositions of the white patriarchy. If there's no such thing as truth, if all there is the power to impose a worldview, then all that matters is who's doing the imposing. The worldview must be imposed by the righteous. They've returned to the pre-Enlightenment idea of the relationship between truth and authority. The only difference is that instead of kings and clerics being the righteous imposers of truth, it's the victims of the white patriarchy. Thus, student radicals of today, the postmodernist types, become allies of Saudi Arabia in supporting censorship. I imagine many of these student types are unhappy, if they knew about it, of the idea of the army having a division devoted to defending the government's narrative against alternatives. However, the only reason they can be unhappy about that is that they don't like the narrative being defended. When it comes to their own narratives, they're all too happy to defend them with no platforming and other restrictions on free speech. Now, it's difficult to control the narrative in a free market of ideas. That's one of the reasons free markets of ideas make so much progress, but it also makes politicians, clerics, and other people with an agenda instinctively hostile to free market ideas. I think this is why we're hearing so much wailing about fake news. Social media makes it even harder to control the narrative. And so these people who wish to control the narrative become hostile to it and want to control the media itself. All this wailing that you're hearing about fake news, I think, is just like the story about the babies being taken from the incubator in Kuwait. It's a pretext for invasion. Next time you hear a politician complaining about fake news and saying he's going to take measures to crack down on it, don't be naive. He isn't trying to protect you, he's trying to protect himself. Freedom entails responsibility. If we're not going to pass the job of filtering ideas for the truth and falsity to the authorities, we must do it for ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean that we all have to become scientists in every field of science and experts in every branch of political theory and so on. That's impossible. We're still going to have to defer to others. But what we want to do is to defer to the people who are likely to be correct, that they're reliable sources of accurate information. Who are those sources? Well, it's going to vary from topic to topic, but here are 2 rules of thumb for making your selection. If somebody has a lot to lose from being exposed as having peddled falsehoods, then they make a reliable source. For that reason, the Financial Times is a more reliable source than Hello magazine. A scientist is a more reliable source about matters of fact concerning the natural world than a Baptist preacher. The second rule of thumb is that if somebody has an interest in what you believe, that's to say they could gain or lose depending on what you believe, then they make an unreliable source. That's why advertisers are most people are skeptical of advertising, because the person doing the advertising obviously stands to gain if you come to share their view that their product is excellent and should be bought. But politicians are in a similar position, and this is why people are rightly skeptical of what politicians say. Many people nowadays lament the loss of confidence in politicians, the loss of faith. I don't. I much prefer a skeptical electorate to a credulous one. Now, even when you've selected your reliable sources of information, you should keep shopping around. If you're a left-winger, read the right-wing press. If you're a right-winger, read the left-wing press. See what the competition has to say. You never know what you might learn. But I do advise you to do it sooner rather than later, because the way things are going, it may soon be illegal to shop around in the free market of ideas. Thank you.